Hey folks, so this is a kind of experimental video because I don't normally talk about this sort of stuff, but to be honest, this is sort of the meat, the bones of what I'm interested in when I look at and review things like Chappie, for instance, in the previous video, or do reviews for books and study culture because I'm interested in what our storytelling, the stories, the collective myths, the films, the novels, the science fiction, what all of those things are saying about our moment in history. And artwork, probably like nothing else, is able to tell us what's actually going on. Now, it's not necessarily what the artist is consciously saying, it's more of a kind of interpretive work so that when you see the piece of art, you have to kind of wrestle with it and feel out what it means to you. And of course, anybody goes through this and experiences this. But then reflecting on that back into culture, you go, well, why is that happening now? Why are movies, about the apocalypse happening now? Well, the obvious reason might be that we're worried about our future or worried about the next generation. I'm concerned about, my future as I get older and what kind of life I'm going to have and my potential children's future because of all of the economic and social and ecological problems and overpopulation. All of those things, they get reflected back into our kind of collective dreaming. And the scholar Joseph Campbell and even Marshall McLuhan, who is a media theorist, said this about our films and about our stories, about our popular culture has a kind of insight into where we're at in our psyches. But at the same time, and this is sort of the other element, it's not just a passive thing where you're receiving the artwork and you're interpreting it and or perhaps even that it's kind of satiating you. It's a kind of catharsis because it's saying something that you feel. There's a powerful element of an artist in that they have the ability to create that for people. But a kind of genuine thing has to take place between the artist and the art in order for that to happen. And of course, not everybody does that. You can have fun, you can tell stories, it can just be popcorn thrillers. But even in those, I would argue that something can come through. And this kind of transformative element of art actually has a really long history with the artist and with what is called magic. And now a lot of artists have been interested in the concept of magic and have been magicians and have been involved in these kinds of schools of thought because of how synonymous artwork and the process of art is with magic and is with these sorts of occult ideas. Now, whether or not you actually believe in magic, as something that's supernatural, is besides the point. Human beings think magically. We cannot help but do that. It's sort of written into our psyches to think this way, and I don't just mean people who are superstitious. Of course, that might be, one way to interpret it, and that's certainly an element of it. It doesn't just mean folks who read tarot cards and talk about the secret and talk about karma and synchronicity and those sorts of things. There's a whole culture around that, but even in the kind of ritualized activities of the modern world, of us sort of worshiping our technologies and seeing them as these enchanted things that have a kind of drawing power. And this, for instance, doesn't necessarily anymore with the latest iPhone, but these kinds of things, especially technology, it has this kind of drawing power. And in place of traditional myths and storytelling, I believe popular storytelling, whether it's pop art or music or films and cinema, or even science fiction, and especially science fiction because it's so technological, has this kind of mythological dimension. So there's a lot of intersections in mainstream culture right here and magic and mysticism and myth, and it's such an interesting topic for me. Uh, but I wanted to make this video really to just sort of hone in on that central connection between magic, art, and transformation. And to get started, I wanted to quote William S. Burroughs, who is a famous beat poet, the author of Naked Lunch and a number of other excellent works that you should definitely check out, and a fascinating figure in his own right. Really interesting life. A little bit dark, but certainly one of the most interesting members of the whole Beats generation. So this is William S. Burroughs talking about magic and art. Quote, "It is to be remembered that all art is magical in origin, and by magical I mean intended to produce definite results." So, you want to bring something in the world, you create it, you bring it forth, it has an influence or it doesn't necessarily have an influence, depends on what you've created, of course. And later on in the quote, he describes, physics and Einstein and how the structure of art and the structure sometimes even of science has a very magical description. They're very similar to magic and ritual in that there's an intention, there's an idea, there's a vision, and there's some act to bring it forth, some kind of creative act to bring it forth. And basically that's the connection between art and magic at its most basic working definition. But it can get a little better, and that's why I have a quote from Carl Abrahamsson's book. I was reading it on the train tonight, called Reasonances, and it's a sort of it's an anthology, it's a collection of essays, but all centering on art and magic in the history of the 20th century, and kind of looking at interesting figures, interesting people who may not necessarily be occultists or magicians, but who are nevertheless very interested in these connections between art and magic. And here's what gets interesting for me is that folks or ideas and practices this strange, and if you're new to this idea that art is actually legitimately magic, if this is something that you're responding to in a kind of if you're against it, if you're reacting against it, this is something that I find to be really interesting, because despite the fact that we kind of recoil from these ideas, especially a lot of intellectuals in our culture, you can nevertheless see at a purely historical level. You don't have to believe in these things. You can see at a historical level that they have had an influence. The belief in these things, the style of thinking, has had an influence on high art and high culture, and so-called low art and pop culture. And one of my favorite writers right now, Jeffrey Kripal, who's a scholar at Rice University, he writes a lot about this, and the best book you can pick up is probably Mutants and Mystics, in which he looks at this very interesting connection between pop science fiction, comic books, and weird magic, esoteric stuff that people were really into. And the next level, the next dimension of this argument is to go into people having religious experiences, and these religious experiences influencing pop culture. So you could even take it that far, but I don't want to do that in this video necessarily. I simply want to make the connection between magic, the belief in magic and ritual, and the ability to transform culture, because as it turns out, they are very connected, and arguably at the heart of most cultural transformation, something that has to do with magic is going on, at the very least in a structural way, and at the very least in a kind of parallel way to the way magic actually is practiced and believed in. But here is Carl Abrahamsson, who's making a very, very powerful connection between all these things, and kind of working, again, another working definition of magic. And I just really enjoyed it. I feel like if you get this, you'll get magic. Anyway, he writes, "It truly is as if magic is a key to understanding the development of human culture. Change doesn't always come with tanks, brute force, financial rape, and industrialization. Sometimes change comes slowly, subtly, and silently through the visions and works of artists. As another mind reacts to the image or the written words or music in question, there is a new creation emergent. A third mind, as Burroughs or Geisson called it." I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Geisson or Gisson. "And that reaction and that mind can easily make a change in so-called real life once its voice is reflected, loudly or silently, through other actions and reactions in the minds of hundreds, thousands, and possibly millions of other human beings. That's why it's truly a holy privilege to be an artist. Please keep that in mind, because it's the only job, along with that of the magician, where you must change and transform yourself and your work constantly, because if you don't, you're just a compartmentalized commodity. If you don't change, nothing or no one else will ever change. That's the magic of it all. So there's a lot of connections here with this idea that artwork, if it's done in this kind of powerful, transformative way, enables you to be you. It enables your psyche, your experience, your meaning in life to come out, to express itself, to have relevance and value, and possibly to influence other people. And in a world where so much is being prescribed to you, artwork can be a kind of insurgency. It can be a kind of revolutionary or transformative act, but not when you're trying to force it to be. You have to genuinely allow it to transform you as it can transform others. But I'll get to that in a moment. So that's Abrahamsson. I thought that was just a very, very powerful explanation for art's power to have an effect in the world, and therefore magic's power to have an effect in the world. And so this is where I wanted to make a connection with another text, another book that came out this year, actually. JF Martel's Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, a good friend of mine, and it's out by North Atlantic Books, and it's an Evolver Editions book, and definitely recommend that you pick that up. And in this text, it's basically making a sort of argument for the most raw, the most succinct definition of art, which is that otherness of it, that ability to surprise you, that ability to meet yourself and meet the kind of strangeness of yourself, and therefore be transformed. Because if you already knew what to expect, that's simply not art. It's stale, it's stagnant, and there's no transformation that can occur. And in the same way, as a person, as individuals, we're always growing, we're always transforming, we're always changing. And if we're not, there's a certain degree of stagnicity, of settling that can take place in us, and not necessarily fulfillment. We may be comfortable, but without a little bit of that strangeness in ourselves, without a little bit of that innovative current, we lose something. We lose a kind of vitality. So, I think that's what Abrahamsson was saying, but James Joyce has a similar definition that JF Martel describes, and it's that we shouldn't try to prescribe too much to our art. That is, we shouldn't try to tell art what it's meant to tell us. We shouldn't try to tell people how to feel in the stories that we tell. We should sort of allow the intelligence of that work of art to speak to us. And again, it's that otherness, that strangeness, and in the very sense, that's sort of what magic is. It's a connection with this numinous strangeness in the world, whether or not we believe there's something literally there or not. The experience of that strangeness, the experience of that intelligence that comes out of the experience of art or magical practice is what can transform us. In a very similar way, of course, it's a cliche now, but Rilke, the poet, the German poet, has this famous line, "You must change your life." And I could just quote him saying, "Would not from all the borders of itself burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life." And again, I don't necessarily, I'm not a literary scholar, so I can't necessarily say what Rilke was meaning here. But for me, he's very much speaking to this raw potency in the way a work of art can transform you and can really change you. So again, it's that affectatious element of art that can actually have a movement into the world and therefore be a kind of practice of magic in itself. And I definitely believe this to be at least a very powerful working definition of magic and of art. So the last part that I suppose I could bring up here without going on too long is this idea not only of personal transformation, but of collective transformation. And art has this knack, and I know it's another cliche, but some folks believe that art has this knack to be an intuitive practice that foresees something about the present, something latent, something that is happening in culture that will eventually erupt and happen later. So, William Gibson, for instance, is um, famous for cyberpunk and all that, and Neuromancer was seen as this thing that prophesized the internet. And to some degree, William Gibson himself has distanced himself from this idea as the prophet of the digital age. And he's repeatedly said, especially in a lot of his later interviews and more recent interviews, that no, I didn't predict anything. It was a fluke. Most of my other stuff was wrong. I got this wrong, and he'll label all the things that he got wrong. But for me, it's not a matter of quantifying how many things you get wrong versus how many things you get right. It's more of a matter of intuition, and it's a little messy here because you can't really quantify or map out how intuition works. Nevertheless, I believe that artwork does have a kind of intuitive way, and it works despite your conscious efforts to say that you didn't predict anything, that you didn't intuit anything. There's a kind of intelligence, again, and it may just be an unconscious intelligence. It may just be parts of our mind that we don't fully understand as conscious waking beings, but can speak to us, can have another type of intelligence, another type of forethought about the world. And in a very real sense, we should look to our own creative processes to kind of inform us about ourselves, because in some ways they're the unconscious and the dream and the work of art, the creative dimension of ourselves, can make life worth living. And it may even be able to give us a kind of knowledge that the conscious waking mind does not have. So that to me would be a sort of retort to William Gibson, kind of, saying like, listen, dude, you were tapping into something, and that's okay. You can't claim it, you can't own it, and it's very great that William Gibson is so quick to say, okay, I wasn't right. Maybe it's better off that he's not owning it, because it is something beyond our understanding, it's beyond our grasp. But it's in here, maybe, and maybe it's out of here. That's not up to me to argue in this video. Other examples, another great text would be Leonard Shlain's Art and Physics, which talks a lot about how a lot of artists' intuitive, scientific, and philosophical breakthroughs and innovations before they happened. And his whole idea is that in the whole evolution of the human psyche, it was the image that emerged before the written word, before and again it's simplifying, but the more left-brained, conscious, analytic, rational, in a more puritanical sense that we associate with the modern mind, with the modern world, with materialism, with the Enlightenment. That kind of thinking emerged later in our brain's history and its development as human beings. So it's the image and its nebulous and iconographic and symbolic forms that has tons of meaning packed into it, a kind of primordial language of the human psyche. And therefore, even though it's not as easy to map out, it has a kind of working knowledge that, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was an early anthropologist, described as an early form of science, and not in the sense of being a primitive science, but being a wholly other kind of science, where I'm trying to everything. He described it. I wish I had the text offhand here, but he described it as a kind of infinite causality where everything is connected to everything else and there's meaning in everything, not like the modern, I suppose, rational thinker and scientific thinker who looks for specific causality in things. A caused B caused C, or even more complex things where a number of factors work together. The more ancient mind, quote unquote, used a kind of infinite causality, infinite meaning in things, and that's the kind of primordial mind that has all of these different symbols and images and aspects of the psyche that bubble up and create a kind of intuitive science. And I think that's actually what he called it, an intuitive science, rather than the kind of modern science that we have. But rather than see this as a linear development, we might suggest that the intuitive science is something that we need to sort of bring back, and something that we've always kept with us through artistic movements. And why folks like William Gibson or some other piece of art seem to be so foreshadowing and so prescient about things in the future. So this has kind of been a broad, sweeping rant about how art and magic are connected, and they're connected to transformation of the person, but they're also connected to transformation of culture. So it leaves a lot in our hands. It leaves a lot of power that we can work with, that we can create with, because the conscious mind, you won't make good art if you have too much control over it, and that's just my opinion. Maybe some folks can really do that, but even then I feel like they're channeling something more in them through that process. So art can change the world, art can affect people, it can transform things, it can intuit things about our world. So when you see a movie next, think about what it is actually, what messages might be coming through. Treat it as if it was a dream, and treat our culture as if we were a kind of collective being that was dreaming these things, and see what you come up with. See what you interpret, because that's what I do with my videos, and that's what I do with some of my writing, and it certainly is what I do with my own art. It's a kind of insight. It's an agent of my own transformation, and I believe at least that if we allow the genuine artistic process to take place in us, it can be a way to transform and renew our culture. And to some degree, I think we've sort of become a little too narrow, a little too prescribed with all of the different. And again, a lot of it is commodification, as Abrahamsson said. But so much of our world is sort of being framed for us. I think it's about time that we take those frames and start breaking them and doing innovative things with them in the way that only creative art-making magicians can do. So that's my little rant, my little manifesto for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening.